Hello. Thank you so much for joining us again, if you're still out there, on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, on whatever platform you're joining us on. I'm Maryn McKenna. I'm a journalist and author and a senior fellow in the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University. We apologize for our technical difficulties. Welcome to the last episode in the 2022 edition of our Author Q&A series, which is a project of the Center's Health Storytelling Project, which is co-sponsored by the Georgia Center for the Book. My guest tonight, whom you're about to meet, is Dr. Emily Willingham, a biologist and journalist and author of a number of books, including Fallacy, Life Lessons from the Animal Penis, which we discussed in this series in 2020. Her new book, from Basic Books, is The Tailored Brain, From Ketamine to Keto to Companionship, a user's guide to feeling better and thinking smarter. I'll be talking to Dr. Willingham about the book's surprising unpacking of what really matters, what works, and what doesn't when it comes to improving how we think, feel, remember, and connect. Let me just do a little bit of housekeeping. In the first part of this live chat, we normally go for half an hour. We might cut it off depending on whether we see if any of you are still out there. I'll ask questions of Dr. Willingham. In the second half hour, I'll ask some of your questions, if you have them. There's a Q&A box. Type your questions into the comment box of whatever platform you are watching on. Our producer, Stefan Kaplan of Spin It Social, will display some of those questions on screen for me. You can ask your questions at any time, but be aware we won't turn to audience questions until the two of us have been talking for a while. We'll try to get to as many as we can. So let's get started. Dr. Willingham, Emily,
Hi,
thank you for
Maryn.
doing this.
How are you? You're welcome.
It is a pleasure to talk to you for the second time about your books. This is great. So let us jump right in. I'm especially since, as I just said, your last book was about penises. This one is about the brain. Some people would argue that those are linked. I am really curious to hear what made you want to undertake this book. So you are not a neurologist or a neuroscientist, I think, but tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I have done just a little bit of research with the brain, and it had to do with sex differences in the brains of vertebrates. But largely my focus, my research was a little lower down in the pelvis. Um, but one of the chapters of Fallacy related to, not more, it's kind of a theme through the book related to our behaviors and how we're so much more than the anatomy that some people try to distill us down to. And it seemed like a good transition. I land on the brain in the very last chapter, perhaps not accidentally, because I knew I was going to be writing this book at that point. And it made sense to do a transition and to talk about the brain. I also, as a journalist, have covered neuropsych and neuroscience and neurology quite a bit, and it was definitely in my beat for a long time.
So did you have this book in mind before the pandemic began?
I did. And the pandemic kind of, it's interesting because not only did I have it in mind, but when the pandemic started, I was still kind of working on a framework for it. And so one of the original frameworks I had a lot more about the pandemic in it. And it was interesting how optimistic some people could be, because after discussing with my editor, the advice I got was that, maybe don't focus so much on the pandemic because we will probably be not dealing with it when the book comes out. And of course, that's not the case at all. And I think now we're facing down sequelae from this for, a generation. But still, I do have a little bit in there. And certainly the process of writing it during the pandemic, I found to be very useful to me, because there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of mood and a lot of other things I talk about in there that I needed some help with, and I found a lot of it in what I was looking at.
So this was sort of it ended up being your personal processing of aspects of the pandemic, as well as being a didactic thing that you wanted to bring to others.
Yeah, it was both of those. Yeah, it's like a therapy, and here I hope this helps some other people as well.
Did having to write this during the pandemic, as you say in your acknowledgments, stuck in your house with your husband and your children, and your elderly dog, did it change the things that you wanted to talk about?
I don't think that it did. What it did do was make me also learn a lot about how to maintain focus in the midst of a lot that's going on around you, because there was a lot, and I'm not complaining about it. There was a gift of time there with the
Mhm.
people I love dearly. But when you are writing a book that has a lot of complexity to it and a lot of complex ideas, it was a little harder to focus than I'd anticipated, for sure.
Um, I find the title of the book very alluring, and I think from the emails I got from people who were planning on watching this during the day today, this generated a lot of excitement, because the subtitle in particular makes a kind of implicit promise that
Mm.
you are going to talk about things that can affect and can help the brain. Um, and the subtitle really breaks down into three kind of categories of things, right? It's uh, drugs and diet and the company of other people, as though that's sort of a menu of, a bulleted list of things that you're just going to run down. But not to spoil the book for people who are watching, um, you find that not all of those are equally efficacious in actually getting your brain to do more of what you want it to do,
I'd say
right?
that's a fair summary. I came to it agnostically. I was really kind of hoping to find something that you could kind of sort of take, and it would do something useful, at least one of the facets of, our brain function that I examined. Didn't really find anything in a bottle. I don't want to, I guess I shouldn't spill the whole takeaway myself. I don't know, but I just didn't. And that's just what it was. Ketamine I examined because it's kind of the leader in the group of drugs that people maybe can access without a prescription if they so choose. And so I wanted to examine that group of no, I don't want to call them supplements, but psychotropically active drugs. And then diet, you see so many claims about it, especially related to keto. And I wanted to dig into that. And I found some interesting case studies and some little hints, but nothing that was just going to knock your socks off. The companionship was key, to just keep using the sound, that makes the title what it is. The companionship really emerged in surprising ways to me as having a very solid evidence base. And you're in the pandemic where it's kind of hard to come by,
Mhm.
especially in person. And I found that kind of it's made it more profound in a way to be writing about it and making that discovery.
Before we talk about what does work, and I particularly want to talk about companionship, a thing I would love to hear you talk about for a moment is the degree to which you found people really are interested in hacking their brains. So fairly early in the book, you talk about people directly stimulating their brains with electricity and with magnetism, which was terrifying to me, and that there are big sort of, I guess, Reddit communities of people who are exchanging tips on how to do this. Can you talk about the sort of the potential audience of biohackers out there for this exploration of yours?
It's interesting what people want to reach for, and one of the points I make in the book is, I think people are reaching to be smarter, or they want to come across as smarter, or be more protean in their capacities and things like that. But you don't see a lot of promises out there to make us more, I don't know, empathetic and connect with each other and sort of deeper companionship type ways. And I do find that interesting, and I think we need to pay more attention to that. And so, yeah, there are subreddits that are voted to things like transcranial direct stimulation, where you just, I just think of it all as brain zapping, but they're doing this, and then they'll come back and they'll say something like, I used to be bilingual and now I'm not. And I can't spell words anymore. It's really alarming. And I quote, I think, from a movie in there, I'm just like, don't fuck with your brains, kids, because, a couple of neuroscientists I spoke, they're like, yeah, these do it yourself things, especially, But there's a huge business. People have this urge or they feel this need like they're not good enough with the brains that they have, and they want to get some kind of edge that it doesn't seem to be a very useful edge to have necessarily. And certainly the magnitude of it is wouldn't be very striking if any of the stuff actually worked as claimed.
Well, we'll stay with the idea of the communities for a minute. Where are people getting their information?
They're getting it all over the place. I mean, I think Reddit is probably one place. I mean, who knows what's going on over at TikTok right now? But I think, you'll probably find some things there. There are ads. There used to be a lot of ads. I'm not going to specify companies here, but making claims about that the things that they had on offer would keep your brain fresh and you would be aging like brains do and all these other things. And some of that certainly hasn't been borne out, and I think got some of them a little bit of trouble, right? But they find it in, I think, a lot of wellness corners of the world. If you eat this or inject that, or in some cases, I guess, smoke this, or I don't know, rub it on your temples. I don't know. There are just lots of claims that get made. And a lot of that, I think, is in the wellness corners of the world.
Hmm. I think before we go any further, we should probably define our terms a bit. You make the point early in the book that the brain itself is complicated, and that we don't know as much about it as we should. But you also draw a distinction between intelligence and cognition, and then talk about both. So let's start there with what are those two concepts? What are those two things?
Sure. People use them interchangeably. They tend to, say that you're measuring like cognitive skill and that kind of thing. And our measure of intelligence, usually people think of, the intelligence quotient and IQ testing. It's the idea is supposed to be that it's capturing some kind of innate aspect of maybe our capacity to problem solve, broadly put. And so intelligence is something that we've tried to measure over and over and over again. And with outcomes that the patterns are not especially consistent. And then cognition is just thinking, is how do you think? And, this intelligence, I think, would be perceived as a proxy for how well you do that. But I do take that up in a couple of chapters of the book and kind of examine it from the perspective of why do we care so much about that? Why do we place so much emphasis on measuring that and having all of these metrics for it and these potentially like alleged pills and other interventions for it, instead of some of these other things that could actually not only improve our own brains, but those of people around us?
And we should say here that the science and I guess the history of the science of intelligence has a lot of really dark chapters in it. As you go into, this was the measuring intelligence and trying to separate intelligence by tribe or race or country was the foundation of a lot of the worst eugenics thought of the 19th and 20th centuries, right?
Yeah, that is a tree whose roots are absolutely bitter eugenicist roots, and it stays that way. I mean, our newest branches on that tree of people who are trying to argue, for example, that race and intelligence sort of go hand in hand. I mean, the foundation of that in itself is a false foundation because race is not a biological construct. It does not arise from biology. So, but yes, those efforts are ongoing from people who like to leverage some alleged scientific metric to reinforce their own supremacy.
Mm. So, without giving all of the book away, walk us through some of the research that you cover and some of the things that you find. I was quite surprised early on to see you quote Benjamin Franklin about how the things that help us most are things like sleep and diet and being humans in the world, though he didn't use those words, and not any of the elaborate things that you subsequently are going to talk about that people have hoped will make a difference.
I know. I felt kind of bad because you come down to it. I went and I dug into, so I just, thousands of things that I dug into, and then you come up with, well, Ben Franklin was right. Like, in the late 18th century is a very wonderful thing. He was a smart guy, but I mean, maybe it was easy for him to get sleep. I don't know, but good sleep is one of them. But we struggle to access that. It's not an easy thing to do. But I I did find that some things that people have been hammering on for a long time, or that maybe just seem like conventional wisdom, they're not just that. There is an evidence base and there are mechanisms. There are like things that are happening physiologically that underlie something like physical activity that you can point to and say, it's not just like, the health authorities are like, go walk 30 minutes a day or whatever. There are things that are happening that explain the benefits of that. It's not just somebody finger wagging at you because they think you're too sedentary. And
Mhm.
I'm hoping that helps people kind of incorporate it and understand why it is important. And it's not just some top down thing that somebody's imposing on them.
It really was striking to me how much of a difference exercise makes. You return to this again and again in several chapters that its its ability to enhance so many of these processes that you talk about is really profound.
Yeah, and there are some pieces of good news here because exercise is just a subset of physical activity. And so speaking of being imposed on, right? A lot of people, for them, the word exercise sounds like a lesson, like you've been assigned
Mm,
Silas
fair.
Marner in movement form, and it's the very like term really can put people off, but it's physical activity in general, even the kind that involves like cooking a dinner and moving around or gardening and things like that. And it doesn't even have to be, there's a couple of recent studies that suggest that, first of all, you definitely don't have to be like somebody who runs marathons. That's just not even necessary at all. And you can just get out for like 20 minutes and get some movement in every day or every other day. Even that amount is going to offer some benefits for us across a lot of facets of how our brains function.
So, I would love to hear you talk for a few minutes about the the aspects of the research you looked at that most address our current moment, which is how we combat stress and anxiety. And what since we are in a global pandemic, not just of an infectious disease, but of the stress and anxiety that come from our encountering it. Um,
Right.
what is the research show? What hopes are there?
Well, the stress and anxiety, of course, are quite real. And when we are experiencing them, we are not otherwise able to think clearly because we're just kind of overburdened. I mean, anxiety really chews up your resources. And you may, if anybody's ever experienced either or both, that you don't think as clearly and as readily, and you certainly can't problem solve as well, speaking, cognitive capacity, when you're overloaded with stress and anxiety. Your brain feels like it's full of bees. And the things that I found that are so useful, one of them is just physical activity. There's something about like some people have said that anxiety is almost like a motor condition
Mhm.
where you have built up enough of it that you've got to get it out somehow. And that movement is one of those ways that you can get that out. And so, in that sense, it involves this kind of motor function. And I just think that's really interesting. It's my personal experiences. It alleviates anxiety for me to move around a lot, certainly. The other thing is that the pandemic has really interfered with this for us while imposing stress and anxiety on us. Is that you connect with other people and you share your burdens with them if they're people whom you can trust with that. And if you are in a situation where you're isolated from them and it's hard to engage, or where politics has, driven a wedge between people with whom you may formerly have been close, you lose that. And so it's again one of the reasons in the book I, hammer kind of, maybe, I don't know, you can tell me if it was too much, but less on how can we be like super smart and be like Bradley Cooper and limitless versus, how can we make connections with people, maintain them and share these burdens with each other so that we don't bear them so much ourselves and our brains feel better.
You talk in the section of the book about stress and anxiety, about some studies that I found just super poignant, which are studies of men in the early days of the HIV pandemic, dealing with the disease themselves or caring for partners, an incredibly grim time
Yeah.
before we achieved the drugs that made HIV the more manageable disease it is today in the industrialized world.
Mhm.
And yet the researchers found that those men were able to balance that stress and anxiety with a practice of, I don't know if it's appropriate to call it a practice of gratitude, but a practice of appreciation
Yeah.
for sometimes quite small things. Can you talk some more about that?
Yeah, I'd love to, because I should have mentioned that just a second ago. In the pandemic, when I was feeling the stress and anxiety, one of the things I did, because I learned it while I was writing this book, was I just stopped. Like when it was just really just like felt like your whole head was just a bunch of spikes, right? I would just stop and look around and go, I'm sitting here. I'm okay right now. There's this, beautiful tree out the window. Just, calm down, be right here in this moment, almost an aspect of mindfulness, right? And so in the studies you're referencing, they kept talking to caregivers, for partners, mostly people who had HIV, and they kept talking about, the the symptoms that they're having, the diseases that they're developing, all these other things in association with it. And eventually, some of the people are like, I would like occasionally to talk about some of the good stuff because, our day to day isn't all just a horror show. We have moments that, are really sweet moments together that we share. We're still sharing life. Life is still happening in the middle of all this. And it was a recognition that, people needed to know that that experience was part of it as well. And so they turned to that, to focus on that a little bit more for the people they were working with.
When I think of some of the accounts of what people did to manage their experience of the pandemic, particularly in the first year, it feels as though people did intuitively some of the things that you're describing happened in those studies. They were locked down at home, but they ordered a bird feeder, and they watched the birds come into their backyards, or they regrew their green onions so they got to have something growing in their apartments. Or if they're fortunate in their location, they go for long walks on the beach or something like that. All of those, that feels like a sort of home-brewed practice of mindfulness and appreciation that really made a difference to how people experienced this.
I think so, exactly. And it's funny you mentioned homebrew, because people also were, I mean, it's not really a homebrew, but it's fermentation. They were all doing their starter bread, their sourdough starters, right? And sharing them with each other. And there was just like, and I thought it was interesting because one of the things that ended up on the cutting room floor from the book was I had this section on the Great British Baking Show and how it was doing this thing that you don't often necessarily see on, this kind of reality TV, where instead of kind of pitting them against each other so much, they were kind of pitting them all against the bake, like, the challenge of the bake. And so it came across that when they were working together on this challenge and all kind of working in the same thing on this challenge, that they bonded over that. And so then you see people with their sourdough starters and like sharing them and putting pictures of them and lots of stuff about baking. And I thought, it's like occupational therapy, but you're also sharing with other people and you're making this most basic, it is the staff of life that you're doing in the middle of all of this horror that's going on around us.
I suspect that some of the people who are watching, thanks to people who did come back and watch us, did not tune in to hear us talk about sourdough. They want to know, what are the drugs they can score? What are the supplements they can take?
Right.
What are the brain training games? You talk about Tom Brady and the company he is involved in that can just make them better. And in that, so first I'm interested to hear you talk about, drugs and supplements and so forth, and whether anything can make people better. But I also would love to hear you think out loud for a minute about how much so many of us have this hunger to make our brains work better.
Yeah. I think I'm going to take the hunger first. I think we're hungry for it. And part because we think, at least we have social cues. If we have a very sort of very active part, a network in our brain, so putative network in our brain, horribly called the default mode network. And if it's really taking over, we get kind of self like focused and we start to not maybe think as well of ourselves.
Mhm.
And I think kind of being anxious and things like that can ramp that up as well. And so when you don't feel good about yourself and you don't trust being your authentic self, then you start to feel like, well, you need to fix something. And we're talking about the core of who you are, and that's your brain. And so I think that that is where that urge comes from. And then society says, well, the best brains are the super smart brains, which is, there are some really smart people out there who are absolute assholes. I don't know how much help they are to anybody, I mean, good for them that they're super smart, I guess, but cui bono? And as far as what I found that works, I mean, the rule of thumb generally is that if you play a game that involves a certain skill set, you're going to get better at it. You're going to get more skilled. You're going to be more competent at that game. But there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that's going to transfer kind of some sort of global effect, global benefit for your whole brain. So if you really like doing the games like that Tom Brady plays, which involves like putting a pointer where butterflies have vanished off the screen and trying to remember that as much as you can. I mean, go ahead. It's great. It could be fun. I was personally bored, but it could be fun, but I had hopes for some supplements and honestly, nothing that stood out. I went in with kind of the one attitude I have was maybe omega-3s will do something. And, they failed the test, especially the most rigorous test, which is randomized control trial testing. There are a couple of things that are looking possibly promising, and that's psilocybin for mood. There are some new studies, but right now they're all kind of coming out of the same shop, which, you kind of want to see. There might be studies coming out of a place that's not super invested over the years
Mhm.
in, finding some positive outcomes. And also the most recent one was with Lexapro up against psilocybin or something like that. And they only ran it for 6 weeks, and it's for mood, right? It's for depression. That doesn't seem like long enough, generally speaking, for an antidepressant study, especially. So I think that's still, we'll wait still to see what that does.
So the fact that you mentioned psilocybin reminds me that I wanted to ask you about the influence of big personalities in this quest for brain hacking, because of course the incredibly successful author and influencer, and I don't even know how to describe him, Tim Ferriss has put millions certainly behind psilocybin research. And then of course we have to mention Elon Musk and his brain electrodes. So there's these huge personalities and these huge amounts of money pouring into this space for potential brain hacking. And I wonder if you worry about that.
I do. Of course I do. I actually come at this generally from a perspective of I don't fool with things too much, because if I don't have evidence that fooling with them is going to get me, has a pretty high rate of getting me an outcome I'm interested in, then I just don't do it. So I'll admit to being really conservative in how I think about these things and the level of evidence I'd like to see. But I think with psychedelics, it's intriguing, right? Because I mean, first you come out of this like backdrop of psychedelics being like, "Woo, don't touch the psychedelic drugs. You're controlled. You can't do all of these things. You can't even do research with them, right?" And now, there are people who are very committed, and not just because they put a bunch of money into it, because they've done it themselves, and they're like, "Dang, this is really working for me." So there's a lot of proselytizing that's going on. I think an interesting study, though, that really kind of made me wonder about any of it is the N of one study that I describe in the book, where they have people who are kind of used to taking psychedelics. I think they were microdosing them, and they were their own controls. And so they were assigned pills, and they took them, and they didn't know if the pills contained their actual usual dose or if they were empty, et cetera, et cetera. And then they kept the little journals, and at the end, so some of them were so convinced they had taken their psychedelic the entire time And they hadn't. Some of them, it had just been basically an empty capsule. And one of them actually said, man, you totally managed to capture spirituality in a pill, And I think that takes you to kind of, well, where is a placebo effect, which is a real effect? And I would, if it works for people, I don't want to be the one who says, oh, that's just placebo. That's not doing you any good, because it clearly is, right? And that's kind of how the brain is. You do a thing to it and you get a physiological response. And then if you do another thing to it that says, no, that thing wasn't actually doing what you thought, your brain's going to respond that way to that as well. And you might undo the benefit you were experiencing. So I'm conservative about all of it, but I would say psilocybin does actually look pretty promising for some things. And of course, ketamine has been in a certain form okayed by the FDA for, that's a prescription thing though.
So we actually have some comments from viewers. Thank you all so much for watching, for coming back and watching us. Let's start with a comment from Sophie, who asks, in relation to our discussion of gratitude, does religion, the practice of religion, have a similar effect on brain health to the kind of non-specific, non-sectarian expressions of gratitude that we were talking about?
I just be my personal take on that is I think so. I think there are two aspects involved in that. One of the things that gives us comfort, I'm sure people who are, who do practice religion will understand this, give us comfort is experiencing tradition and knowing we're sharing that with other people who also share that, who have experienced that tradition with us. And so there's a sharing there. There's a social aspect, obviously, to a lot of the practices and a lot of religions. So there's that routine and that sharing and that knowledge that other people are out there sharing that with us. And I think that helps us feel more grounded and feel more centered. And then if your religious practice involves that kind of sense of spirituality, there are the part of the brain that is engaging in that, I think, is similar between them, whether you're doing it in a secular way of, wow, it's amazing this tree came from a little seed, or you're practicing your religion and feeling the spirituality of that.
Another viewer, Rayan, I apologize if I'm not saying that correctly, Rayan Syed asks, what do we know about, given that so much of our interaction was virtual during the pandemic, do we get different benefits or lesser benefits from virtual interactions like this than we do from actually seeing each other face to face?
I think that there probably is a distinction, but everybody's different. So everybody has different levels of what they seek out of social interaction. And for some people, like what Maryn and I are doing right now would be plenty. Whereas other people really, really, for just that that feeling of satisfaction, that feeling of sharing, that in person matters. And there are studies that show when you are in person with other people, more gets into sync than just the conversation you're having or the feelings that you're sharing. There's some other physiological processes that kind of get into rhythm with each other. And I don't know if if Maryn and I might be doing that right now or not, because we're distant from each other and this is just technology. So it's highly variable. I think you seek the level and the process and the platform and the volume that works best for you, makes you feel good. And then you don't have to do what everybody else does. Mary Oliver said, that if she's out in nature with another person, she must love that person very much. And that's about my level.
So because we're talking about online access and having, both the ability to have these virtual relationships, I think it's important to turn to a question that is being asked by Amna Soniwala. And that is, are the kind of treatments, the kind of biohacking, brain hacking that we're talking about, are they available across the socioeconomic spectrum? Or are we really talking here, when people talk about hacking their brains, about something that only the privileged can do?
Right. That's a great question. And the do-it-yourself kits for the kinds of things they talk about on Reddit, the transcranial stimulation that had some pretty alarming outcomes. I mean, those kits are maybe $35, which is going to be out of reach, for a substantial portion of people. But, I wouldn't try those anyway because they're not. That was scary to read some of that and to talk to one of the experts about it. In the last chapter of the book, I talk about some things that they're looking at down the road in terms of brain hacking and the future, and lots of things like sharing memories, planting memories, putting memories on hard drives, accessing other people's brains from a brain. I mean, just things that make you go, whoa. And the problem there is not only will it create social disparities without question, because rich people would probably be able to access these and not rich people won't, but also I think it creates vulnerabilities in people who are not able to defend themselves against what could turn out to be some unwanted incursions.
Mm-hmm. We are suddenly getting a lot of questions. We're close to 7:00. Would you like to keep going?
Yeah, it's fine with me. Sure. Yeah, I have that time. Thank you.
So going back to this question of how we experienced the pandemic and how that affected our brains, Zoe asks whether this was different for different generations. And I'll expand on that a bit. People who are more digitally native, was this easier on them? Was it harder on young children? Was it harder on people who didn't grow up with computers? Do you have any thoughts about the intersection of the pandemic and stress and anxiety and access to the digital world?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't address it directly in the book, but I think it became really apparent that certain populations in this country, at least, suffered more than others during the pandemic. And if we're talking about the human disconnect part of it, parents with young children, it was a huge struggle for them to either try to work and not have childcare or not be able to afford the childcare because they couldn't work. Huge, just the stress associated with that is just astronomical. Where when they stopped with the rent support in a lot of places, the stress and anxiety, it's just kind of hard to describe how much stress can be associated with not knowing where you're going to be able to live next, much less whether it will involve four walls and a roof. There were also, I think, older people who, yes, digitally speaking, either because of socioeconomic obstacles or just because they hadn't gotten engaged with it before, struggled to have the digital connections with other people. I know we actually did some Zooms with family and they were just kind of awkward and weird and not, we did that for Christmas and for Thanksgiving. And it was just, I loved seeing everybody so much, but obviously it was not anywhere near the same way. And I do think the older people kind of struggled with that, but it was what it was, and we took it, and we were glad we could do it. But yeah, absolutely, different people had different experiences, and some of the anxiety and stress from that are just immeasurable.
I think it's time to turn to talking about the last section of the book in the future, and that gives me a chance to ask a question from Danielle Feldman, who is watching. She would like to know, what supplements or drugs or brain hacking technique do you think should be studied?
I will tell you that I think that the one that needs the most study and actually study preferentially from people involved in bioethics is this idea of what we may be doing with memory. That, I mean, there are people who are really highly respected neuroscientists at very highly respected institutions right now who are talking kind of with a straight face about being able to access memory or implant memory or put memory on a hard drive. And I think the idea of implanting memory especially is just terrifying. That just is, the things the way bad actors could abuse and access like that is kind of horrifying. And so that would be the one that I would like to see studied the most, but not because I'd like to see it advance. I want to see people get out ahead of it and set some ethical boundaries and guidelines for it.
So with that as a springboard, let's talk for a minute about what you see coming. In the last section of the book, you talk about drugs for memory loss, separate from this idea of like uploading your consciousness to somewhere or allowing someone direct physical access to your consciousness. That as the the elephant in the python is moving through the population curve, as we have the aging baby boom. Drugs for memory loss, as well as drugs to combat Alzheimer's, are becoming big research priorities. Yes.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they always have been. That's, I think, journalists aren't supposed to use this term, but those would be the holy grail. If you could find something that slowed, the progression of aging, and certainly that ameliorated the dementia related conditions like Alzheimer's. I think that those would be, those are desiderata for sure, but we still seem so far away from both of those things. And, they had thought, like, just this, the thing about neuroscience is really, you start getting into it and you're like, what the hell? Because first of all, nobody ever uses the same name for anything, right? Or they're just like 10 different names for like a region of the brain or a circuit. I mean, everybody uses different names. The studies are not done the same. You can't like compare across studies very easily because they don't use the same designs or not anything that seems especially well like structured that somebody goes, oh, well, I'm going to do this the way they did it so that we can build up, the data for it. And there have been some things that have been dogma around things like Alzheimer's that now maybe they're learning after a great deal of time are not the where we should be looking. And so there are new hypotheses arising around that. And it just feels like we're still kind of a really long way from anything that genuinely achieves what people are hoping to achieve with those. Sorry.
So I'll make this my last question.
Physical activity.
So you're starting to answer my last question. So if, as I said when we started talking, I think a lot of people probably tuned in because they were kind of hoping for advice and recommendations, like take this drug, take this supplement, play this brain game. I think you have unfortunately burst those bubbles.
I am so sorry.
But so what's your advice to people who are watching us now about if you want to tailor your brain, if you want to improve your cognition, your memory, reduce your stress,
right,
what should they do?
I will say what I took away from it, and it's something that anybody can nip and tuck to their own proportions as they need to. One is definitely physical activity, and that is because for several reasons. It boosts, physiologically, it boosts levels of molecules that, actually do refresh our brain connections. And, that could maybe be antidotal in a way to some of the effects of aging. Oxygen flow to the brain. There's some studies that are showing that there's some metabolic outcomes in the brain related to that might mitigate against Alzheimer's. And, physical activity helps with that. The other thing about physical activity is I think, there's a hypothesis anyway, and one professor wrote a whole book about this, is that when we do it, our bodies kind of get out of a zone where we've sustained a little bit of injury, and it's like, oh my gosh, we're a little bit out of the zone. And so our bodies have to go, oh, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and get us back into the health zone. And so our bodies are kind of like, they are in practice with this resilience to these insults, because physical activity kind of makes us practice that. And so we get a little out of the zone because of activity, and our body's like, oh, I know what to do. And it gets us back in again. And in that way, we have a habit of physiological resilience as a result of being active. So it's not just get out and be active because I said so. It's because of these things that are happening. The other two things are really actually mindfulness, which is not my bag. Like, I've never been drawn to these things. I'm kind of a hyper person. Physical activity is way more my thing. But there was a lot of evidence that I found that says that getting yourself into the moment, into focus, without judgment, just being in that moment and recognizing it for what it is, can be really helpful, especially for things like stress and anxiety. And then the other thing is the social interaction. I said this is somebody who, like I just said, I like to be out in the woods by myself. And so if I have somebody else with me, this is my level of social interaction that works for me. It's because I love them very much. But it's just, if you have people you can trust, right? Your ride and die people, and you can share with them and tell your stories and resonate with each other and make your faces at each other and go, oh no, and do all these things that you do, that releases so much for us and keeps us having these connections. And there are studies that show if we do that, that is another thing that could mitigate against the progressions of aging.
I'm sorry to everybody who signed in expecting to hear recommendations for particular supplements. I'm grateful to everyone who connected. I'm sorry about our technical difficulties. You've all asked very smart questions. I'm sorry we don't have time to get to all of them. But Emily, thank you so much for this fantastic discussion of your book. Everyone, thank you for listening and for interacting with us. Please consider buying Dr. Willingham's book and visiting her website to learn about her other books and her journalistic writing. All of the links that you will need are in the ticker at the bottom of the screen. Just watch them go by. And we'll also add them to the comment feeds of all the platforms that you're watching on. And this is our last author chat of the semester. The series will resume around Labor Day. We don't have an exact date yet, but we will have me interviewing authors all through the fall semester at Emory to learn about our next slate once they all get harassed by me into agreeing. Please watch our center's Twitter account, twitter.com, EmoryCSHH for the Center for the Study of Human Health, and also the center's blog, exploringhealth.org. And in the meantime, please consider signing up for the newsletter of our sponsor, the Georgia Center for the Book, to learn about their regularly scheduled author events. Until next fall, thank you for joining us. I'm Maryn McKenna from me and from the Center for the Study of Human Health and the Georgia Center for the Book. Thanks for watching. See you in a few months. Stay safe.